Hello YouTube, Sidekick here in my F-4E Phantom 2 on the island of Cyprus. Today we're doing a flight that's just a little bit different than normal. Not going to be blowing anything up this time. Instead, we're going to be looking at the navigation system in the Phantom 2, and you can see me here changing the frequency of the navigation radio to match the VOR station at Paphos, which is where we currently are on the tarmac. So I decided to make this video specifically because a viewer that watched a similar video on the A4 asked me if I was planning to do the same thing for the F4. And I took a look at it and realized it's probably a good idea. Like a lot of things in the F4, the navigation system is a little bit of an acquired taste, as my mother would say. You really have to know something about how to use it before it starts to make sense. And as is typical in the F4, the manual gives a technical description of how it works, but it's not very helpful in trying to get you to the point where you can make use of it. So, what I decided to do is put together a little flight here in Cyprus where we can try out pretty much all of the available navigation modes using the nav aids on the map.
Alright, who's ready to go flying?
So, we're just taxiing out to the runway here, and I will tell you a little bit more about, we'll go over how the navigation system, how the controls in the cockpit work, and how the indicators work, and I'll tell you a little bit about the flight plan that we're going to be flying today once we get out to the runway. So let's just taxi out, and we'll talk once we get out there.
Alright, tell me, are we going downtown on this one?
No, Jester, we're not. I should point out that I am just going to do this from the front seat. There are some nuances that you could make use of if you have a backseater to help you with the navigation, but maybe I'll talk about that in another video if anybody wants me to, but for now we're just going to talk about how to use the navigation system in the front seat and how to use it even without actually relying on Jester. Okay, as you can see, it's a lovely day here in Cyprus, and we're just about lined up on the runway. Once we got lined up, I'm just going to freeze the video. And let's talk about the navigation system in the F-4E, and let's use the pictures from the actual manual. So, first of all, here is the setup. It's in the middle of the front console. Obviously, the top indicator there is the attitude and direction indicator, or ADI. It's labeled 4. It's basically the big ball in the middle of the panel. Below that is the HSI, the horizontal situation indicator, and there's a number of markers on there that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. To the right are two dials that basically control what sources of data drive the various indicators on those two dials, on the ADI and the HSI. So here's a close-up of those dials, and you can see that the one on the left, labeled 1, is the bearing and distance mode dial, or source dial. And you can see you can use a bunch of different sources from the nav computer, an ADF, the TACAN, or the VOR and the TACAN. VOR TACAN means VOR will be used for bearing, and TACAN will be used for distance. So these basically drive some indicators on the HSI. The way I look at it is essentially this is the outer ring of the HSI, but once we actually start using it, I'll explain that a little bit more in flight. Now, on the right-hand side, the little knob in the middle labeled 2 is called the flight director knob, and it controls whether or not you actually transfer any of this navigation data to the indicator on the ADI. We'll talk a little bit about why you might want to do that and what that will look like when we're in flight. The dial labeled 3 is called the navigation mode selector, and what it does is it controls essentially the center part of the HSI, which is something called the course deviation indicator, and it also uses the heading bug or heading indicator. And again, you can use a bunch of different sources for this. You can just set it manually, so you can set your heading manually and everything will be read off of that. You can use the data that's in the navigation computer, or you can use the TACAN, or you can use the VOR or ILS system to derive that course deviation indicator, and also to read the heading bug and transfer that information to the flight director if you have the flight director set. So that may or may not make sense to you depending on how much you know about these kinds of instruments. I really do think it's easier to just get up and fly and talk about how those various data sources are represented on the two instruments, on the ADI and the HSI. So let's get taken off, and then we'll spend a little bit more time as we try out different modes. We'll take a look at how they affect what you see. Okay, let's restart the sim, power up. Once we've got stable power, we will go brakes off, and we are off like a herd of turtles.
Engine's good. Airspeed's coming alive. 80 knots. There's 100 knots.
And ease it off the runway. Try not to go too high.
Gears moving.
All right, looks like we are successfully off the ground. So for this first part of the exercise, you'll notice, if you were looking, you'll notice that both the bearing and distance selector and the mode selector are set to nav.
All right, next turn point is in.
So as we pass the turn point that was set in the mission editor, you will notice that the arrow on the HSI has swung to point to the next waypoint. So what we do is we turn until that arrow is at the top of the dial, which is our heading. Our current heading is at the top of the HSI dial. When the arrow pointing to the next waypoint is also there, then we are flying towards the waypoint. Now we're using the navigation computer. Now, normally, if you were flying in a real jet, you would have had to set those waypoints into the computer, or rather, your Wizzo would have had to do that, or your Rio. We are just using the nav points that we set up, the waypoints we set up in the mission editor, so we don't have to do that, and Jester takes care of switching between them automatically. So we're still flying towards the second waypoint. We have both a bearing and a distance indicator that is coming from the navigation computer. But once we get to that second waypoint, we're going to want to change the way we navigate. We're going to navigate towards Gesset-Calais, and we're going to use the VOR station there as our source for data. So the first thing we have to do is we have to change the navigation radio to the VOR station at Gesset-Calais, which I've now done. So you can see we're still tied to the nav system. You can see the nav light on there on the HSI. And just making sure we got the autopilot on before we start messing around. Okay, I'm going to freeze it there. I have changed the bearing and distance selector to VORTAC, and you can see that some of the indicators on the HSI have changed. Specifically the arrow, the little white arrow, which is essentially the direction finding arrow that points to the source of our navigation data, has switched from pointing straight up, which is where the next waypoint is. When it was using nav, that's what it pointed to. Now it's pointing to the VOR station that we have tuned, which is the one at Gesset-Calais. You'll notice, by the way, that the distance number also flipped because the distance is now being measured from the TACAN station that we are monitoring, which is the one that's still back at Paphos. So the distance measurement's not very useful to us at this moment in time. Now, we haven't changed the navigation mode selector from nav, so that's why the nav light is still on. And it's also why the center indicator, the course deviation indicator, is all still centered up because we are still flying towards our navigation point. Okay, let's restart the sim. Okay, let me change the dials around, and then we'll freeze it again. So this time the bearing and distance knob is set to navigation. So the distance measurement in particular is still measuring the distance to our waypoint, and the bearing arrow at the top of the dial is also still at the top of the dial, pointing to where the waypoint is. On the other hand, the middle of the HSI has now changed. This again is the course deviation indicator. You can see that there is a vertical line that has shifted over to the right. What this is going to do is going to tell us how close we are to the course that we want to fly to get to the next navigation station. And so what we're able to do with the VOR, and this is different than if we had a non-directional beacon, we couldn't do this, but with the VOR, with very high frequency omni-ranging, we can not only get an indication of where the site is, which you saw just before when we had the dial set the other way, but now we can also set a course that we want to fly to approach that VOR station. This would obviously come in handy if we were planning to land at a runway. We would want to approach the VOR down the runway direction. So we would set a course that would get us on course to fly over the VOR going in the right direction, not merely how to get to the VOR. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the course knob, we're going to change it to the course we want to fly, which happens to be 90 degrees because we want to fly this leg going due east. So I'm going to set the course knob to 90 degrees, and you'll see the CDI change as it measures how close we are to that course, and I'll tell you what it's showing you once we get it set. Just a sec. Okay, you can see me dialing up the course here, but I kind of have to hurry because we're almost to our waypoint. You can see the distance number counting down, and once we get to the waypoint, things will start happening in a hurry. So I'm just going to pause it here and tell you what you're looking at, or what we're looking at on the course deviation indicator. So you can see that the line that was vertical is now lying almost horizontal, and it's above the symbol for the aircraft, so it's in front of us. Basically, what its position is telling you, two things. It's telling you how far off the heading you're going to have to be. That's how far off vertical it is. When this line is vertical, you're very close to the heading you want to be flying. How far it is off center tells you how far off the course that you want to fly you are. So essentially what it looks like here is that we're approaching a line where we're going to have to turn to the right. And when we turn to the right, that line is going to start to go closer to vertical, and it's going to start coming closer to passing through the center of the aircraft. Ultimately, we want it perfectly vertical and in the middle. So I'm just going to let the sim go, and you're going to see exactly what happens, because we're just about to pass over the waypoint, so things are going to happen fairly quickly here. Okay, as we approach the waypoint, the line is going to move down to the middle. That's because we're crossing the actual intersection of the course we want to fly, so we need to turn. We need to turn to try and make that line vertical, and we want to turn quickly enough that it doesn't slide off to the right, so that it stays in the middle. And we're just turned a little bit late, so we're going to end up a little bit off center, I think. Now notice I have not changed the bearing and distance mode knob yet. So the bearing arrow and the distance number are still to our old waypoint 2. So once I get established in the turn here, I can reach down and turn that. And now the indicator is going to point towards Geset Calais VOR, and it's going to give a distance to the Paphos TACAN, because that's what our TACAN is turned to. Okay, so we went a little bit past our course, and now I'm coming back to the left. And what I want is to have the CDI line vertical through the aircraft symbol, and I want the bearing indicator arrow to be at the very top of the display. And that's about where we are there. So let me just explain what we were looking at with the CDI there a minute ago. So the way the CDI needle works is that it will be displaced from the center depending on how far off the course that we have set we are flying to the VOR. So it's going to tell us how to stay on a course that flies directly to the VOR at 90 degrees due east. When it is deflected to the right, it means we have to change our heading to the right in order to intercept that course. How far off the course we are is what sets how far off the center it is. Basically, each one of those hash marks is 2.5 degrees. So when it's fully to the right, we're 5 degrees off course, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually a very sensitive indicator. And so you do have to get practiced at managing to intercept essentially that CDI course line in time to get it flown right down to the middle so you don't overshoot or undershoot. Takes a little bit of practice. We didn't do too badly there, but we did have to correct ourselves. So now with the CDI line through the middle of the aircraft and vertical, we know that we are heading towards the VOR that we have dialed, and we are on the course that we have selected that we want to approach the VOR from, which is 90 degrees. Okay, with all that set up, we're going to do one more thing, and that is to use this dial to set our heading bug. We're going to set it to our current course, and then we're going to flip the flight director dial to the left, which basically means that now the flight director line on the ADI is being driven by a comparison of our course to the heading bug. And since we're basically on that course, we have a flight director line that's in the middle. So we're all set up to fly toward Gesit-Kali, but that's not what our flight plan says we're going to do. So let me explain to you a little bit about what we're actually going to do here. Let me put it in autopilot, and then let's take a look at the flight plan. So as you have seen, we took off here, and then we flew to waypoint 1, turned north to waypoint 2, and then when we intercepted the reciprocal of the 90 degrees, so the 270 degree radial, we turned onto that radial to fly directly towards Gesit-Kali at a heading of 90 degrees. And we're not going to fly over Gesit-Kali, though. We're going to wait until we're due north of Larnaca, intercept the 0 degree radial coming out of Larnaca, and fly due south. Then we're going to fly over Larnaca, and we're going to intercept the radial for the runway at RAF Akrotiri, and that is going to be where we're going to end this flight. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is grab the data for Larnaca. We want the VOR at Larnaca, and there it is there. Now we need to hop back in the cockpit, tune our nav radio to that frequency. Now our VOR is going to be driven by the VOR from Larnaca, not the VOR from Gesit-Kali. So you can see that we now are showing that we're off course, because of course we're not flying towards Larnaca, and we don't want to make that turn yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set our mode back to manual, which will mean now we can just set whatever heading we want, which is going to be 90 degrees. And we're going to keep flying our 90 degree heading. What we're going to do is watch the bearing arrow there on the top of the HSI, and as it rotates around, when it gets to be off our right wingtip, that's the point where we're going to want to turn towards Larnaca, and that's going to be when Larnaca is due south of us. Here, I just got to redo the heading bug here. And so now the flight director is going to continue to tell us where to fly to stay on our 90 degree heading, and we're going to be able to watch that bearing arrow move around the HSI, and as it gets close to being due south of us, then we can swap back over to VOR mode, and then we'll fly and intercept the 0 degree radial coming out of Larnaca, fly over Larnaca. Okay, back in the cockpit now, taking a look. If I look at the HSI, we're getting down to something like, the Larnaca's within about 10 degrees of being a beam. So probably time to reset our nav equipment here. So we're going to switch off of manual and go back to VOR ILS. And that's going to mean that our CDI changes, but this time we also need to change the course. We had a course of 90 degrees set. Now we need to change that to 180, because that's the course we want to fly to Larnaca. And then we need to change our heading bug so that it's also on 180. And so now we have the CDI showing us that we're basically approaching our, we're about to intercept the radial at 90 degrees to the radial. We can see from the bearing arrow how quickly we're approaching that as it moves around to match our heading. And we've also got the flight director showing us which direction we're going to have to turn to get to the heading we want to go to. So we are all set up We just need to wait. Yeah, it's about good here. And so now we're going to make the turn. And we're going to make the turn fairly slowly because we don't want to turn ahead of the CDI needle. But it's going to move quickly when it moves. So we're just going to pretty much keep that flight director needle in the middle. Gives us a nice turn rate. The flight director doesn't tell you where your heading is. It tells you whether or not you're turning correctly to reach it. So this is a good rate of turn. That line is gradually getting vertical and moving to the middle. And that was a much more controlled turn onto course than our one the last time was. So I'm liking that. Okay, we're going to get firmed up on course. Now we need to do one more thing to prepare for going over Larnaca. Once we pass Larnaca, we're going to be using the nav aids at RAF Akrotiri, and we're going to specifically switch to TACAN. So we've been using VOR up until now. Now we're going to switch to TACANs, channel 107. So we need to go back in the cockpit and change our TACAN to 107. And once we've done that, all of the distance measurement, the TACAN distance measurement, will be to Akrotiri. Remember that VOR stations do not give you a distance, they only give you a direction and a course to fly. The TACAN gives you those two things as well as the distance. So just checking to see what the TACAN is saying. Still off our right nose, but also giving us a distance. And we'll just leave the selectors on VOR for now until we overfly Larnaca, and we'll be able to tell when that happens because the needles will suddenly flip. As soon as we do that, we're going to switch to TACAN. We're going to dial in the course we want to fly, which is 100 degrees because it's runway 10. Well, actually, it's runway 28, the reciprocal of runway 10. But we can do all that once we overfly Larnaca. So as you can see, we're still over the middle of Cyprus. But we are coming up to the coast and Larnaca. Now, you can see the CDI is starting to deflect a little, getting a little bit of noise. That probably means we're getting pretty close. Things are getting kind of sensitive. And in a minute, it's just going to slide off to the left and everything is going to flip over. And that's going to be the indication that we've flown past Larnaca and that here it goes. And so we're going to want to pick up our next navigation station. We're going to switch to TACAN. We're on the Akrotiri TACAN. Now we need to dial up the course that we're going to want to be flying when we get to Akrotiri, which is 100 degrees. Sorry, which is 280 degrees is what we're going to fly. 100 degrees is the reciprocal from Akrotiri. I apologize for that. And we want to set our heading bug again to 280. And so now we can see just the last thing we want to check is now we need to go and look at Akrotiri and look up the ILS frequency, because once we get onto the runway radial and close enough to Akrotiri, we're going to want to switch to ILS to bring us into the runway. So we're going to change the VOR, the nav frequency radio now has been set to the ILS frequency. So to recap, we are tracking the TACAN at Akrotiri. We have a course set up for runway 28. We're going to intercept that radial, and once we're on that radial and descending, we're going to monitor the ILS, and when we're within range of the ILS, we're going to switch to ILS, and then the flight director is going to give us both bearing and glide slope indications, and that's what we're going to land on. So we're within about 35 miles or so of Akrotiri. It's probably time to start losing some altitude and get down under this cloud layer. So let's descend here, do a controlled descent, and hopefully just about the time we get down under the clouds, we will have intercepted that runway radial and we'll be ready to make our turn. Okay, here we are coming out of the base of the cloud layer. You can see that we're on TACAN. We are approaching The runway radial, it's going to be a slightly more than 90-degree turn. We can tell that by looking at the CDI needle. And now we're just going to go around, try and keep the flight director needle reasonably centered. And watch the CDI needle move around the dial. You want to be sensitive to watching it move into the middle as well. Don't want to turn too quickly. Try and intercept that radial smoothly. There is a bit of technique involved in this, and I can't say that I'm an expert, but it's something that's worth learning how to do well, I think. Because we have decent visibility today, you can actually see Akrotiri there. We could do a visual approach, but I think it's worth learning how to do this on instruments, even when you can see the runway. Okay, now we're going to switch to ILS for our final approach, and we'll notice that things shift a little when we go to ILS. The TACAN is actually not centered on the runway. So while it's good for a course approach from a certain distance, it's not really the best way to line up, especially if you're actually doing this in instrument conditions. So we've gone to ILS, and now we're just cleaning up our heading and our course to try and get straight down the center line of the runway. And we're watching our distance because we're still getting the TACAN distance and making sure that we're somewhere close to glide slope. Now, I'm not seeing it on the flight director, and that's because I don't have the flight director knob set to a flight director. So here in a sec I am going to correct that, and then we will actually be seeing the ILS, both the heading and the glide slope will be on the ILS when we switch the flight director over to actually using that as its source of data. So let's do that. Now when I swap it over, you can see that now we're using the ILS as the source of data, and as I was saying before, okay, now we're a little bit farther off the runway heading than we thought we were because we were using the TACAN data. So very important to make sure that the data mode was properly set correctly, not just the bearing and distance knob. So as with a lot of things in the F4, you really got to have the checklist of where to make sure all of your switches and knobs are set. So we should have checked to make sure that our mode was in ILS, as well as having our bearing and distance indicator in VOR TAC. Okay, so now we are on the ILS, and you can see that we have a good indicator to be lined up on the runway. We're also a little bit below glide slope, but it's time to get the gear down and the flaps out and start improving our glide slope. Now we're a little bit high on the glide slope. Doesn't take much. So we're pulling back on the power a little bit. Pulling back on the power a little bit, waiting for the glide slope to come down. We're also trying to pull off just a little bit of speed.
Gear, flaps, pressure, warning lights, anti-skid.
So still a little bit high descent rate here, pulling back the power even more to try and get that glide slope down to where we want it to be. The speed is coming into range. I think the glide slope's going to start to come. The thing I find with the F4 that's really hard is you really don't want to get too far ahead or behind of the power curve. Things can change pretty rapidly, especially when you're going slowly. So we can see we're coming down to the glide slope now. So I'm putting power back in to try and keep the glide slope from overshooting. So I'd rather be a little high than a little low, all things considered. Keeping an eye on the runway out the cockpit as well. We're a little high, but we're down the middle. Not getting any higher, at least not appreciably, so we're just going to kind of nurse it down. Nurse it down. We're a little fast again. Try and bleed off some speed. Bleed off some speed, but not get too low. There's the glide slope decreasing again, coming up to the middle. Don't let it get too low. Power coming back in. And we drop the nose and speed up a little. Definitely landing the F4 is something that you need to practice. A lot more than I have. Okay, glide slope's not bad. Speed's a little fast. Try and bleed off some of that speed without raising too much above the glide slope. Bleeding off the speed. We're a little bit high. Bleeding off the speed, staying a little bit high. Now it's coming down.
500.
Now it's coming down. Speed's coming into range. Still a little high on the glide slope. Still a little high, but we're looking good on the runway out the window. Speed's coming down. Speed's coming into range. And
300.
over the inner marker. And now we're on
100.
speed, a little bit low, a little bit high on the glide slope. Pull back the power and let it settle. Let it settle. Let it settle. There we go. And we are down.
Gee, man, I always wanted to be a few inches shorter.
Yeah, right, Jester. All right, let's deploy the parachute and get the brakes out. We landed a little bit far down the runway, but I think we're actually going to manage to stay on it, which I would say for a change, given the way I land the F4 a lot of the time. So let me just pause and recap what we did. We flew a little flight plan on Cyprus that allowed us to use the navigation system as the source for our nav instrument data. We used the VOR. We used the VOR. We used the TACAN. We did a couple of turns where we intercepted VOR radials. We used the TACAN to intercept a runway radial, and then we used the ILS to give us heading and glide slope to actually land on the runway. Now, we did all of that in pretty much in visual flight conditions, although when we were up high, we couldn't see the ground that well. So I think the navigation system worked. I was really happy to have practiced this mission. It's something you need to get used to. I mean, the thing about the F4 that I think is a little bit dislocating for people who fly more modern jets is that everything is controlled by a switch or a dial, not by a menu on a multifunction display, which on the one hand gives you a lot more to remember in some ways, but on the other hand, if what you have is a checklist that tells you where all the dials and switches should be set, then it's really easy to check in a cockpit like the F4s. It's really just, you can even do it by touch. So the F4 really comes from a different generation when pilots set up their aircraft using switches and dials rather than by using menus on a multifunction display. And for guys who flew in that era, this would not be that strange at all, although it still is a little odd for those of us who didn't grow up with that. So that's going to be it today for the F4 navigation exercise. I hope that was useful. If you have any questions or comments, definitely leave one in the comments below, but also feel free to drop by my Discord channel and continue the conversation. Thanks for listening, and this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.